The final season of The Umbrella Academy has recently premiered, and it's safe to say that it didn't live up to the expectation that I think many of us had when we found out that it was returning for the final time. In a show that usually has 10 episodes in a season, we were given 6. Yeah, just 6. Something which I feel was a telling sign that the platform was just done with the show and wanted nothing more to do with it. With a story that was rushed, an ending that kind of just made everything a bit pointless, along with many other reasons, I thought I'd take a look at the Umbrella Academy from over the years, analyse the drop-off and try and understand why it happened. So let's get into it. Here is the downfall of the Umbrella Academy. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers from Season 1 to Season 4. The fall-off of the villains. One thing that I feel the Umbrella Academy had in its heyday of Season 1 and Season 2 was not only stakes that were incredibly high, but it had a selection of villains that almost felt animated and out of this world when it came to their delivery. For example, in Season 1, Hazel and Cha-Cha were incredible to follow, not only because of the strength and challenge that they posed to the Umbrella Academy, but also the conflict that started to form between them and the comic relief that Hazel would often bring with his presence on screen. As well, when you look at Season 2, the Swedes were also a fantastic incorporation. 3 siblings that were not only striking to look at because of their appearance, but their silence was something that was almost deafening, and it made them more intimidating. I also feel they were part of one of the most emotional scenes in the show, which was when they had the funeral for one of their brothers and the Swedish version of Hello was playing in the background. That's genuinely one of the most memorable moments in the show for me. As well, within that season, we saw the Handler and also Lila being a villain, which concluded with an incredible battle in the final scene and a twist where Five had to go back in time by a few minutes and save his siblings from being killed. Season 3 was where the villains kind of took a bit more of a backseat and the drop-off began. This was what felt like it was the start of the story of Reginald being the main villain of the show, something that it felt like it was always building towards, especially with us seeing that he was an alien and he essentially wanted to reset the universe and it become a place where he essentially had an empire. As well as that, they kind of made Alison a bit of a villain too, which I just don't think worked at all. She killed Harlan, she made a deal with Reginald, and she just became a bit selfish. It felt very out of character considering how unified the group had been when it came to the bigger picture. Reginald being the villain was fine, but it should have had more of a focus and development. The sad reality is, within Season 4, it only got worse. Not only was Reginald not really a villain anymore because they were in a different timeline, but we had Jean and Jean, who were just essentially some conspiracy theorist cult leaders. They didn't look cool, they didn't have the best chemistry, they forced a dance scene in there, they didn't really engage in fights that were on a grand scale or ever fight the Umbrella Academy properly. It just felt like the show was trying to reignite a chemistry like what we saw with Cha-Cha and Hazel in Season 1. So considering that the show is about heroes and villains, the villain aspect of the show really did fall off in Season 3 and the quirky, entertaining villains were no more. Why did the Umbrella Academy stop using their powers? For me, in Season 4, it felt like the powers that some of the Umbrella Academy had were nerfed and they didn't really use them that much. Granted, they lost their powers at the end of Season 3, but they regained them in Season 4, and some of them even had new ones. However, they were never really utilized that much. Five's power was once so cool, but he never really had it under control until the final moment in the show when he had to blink into the building. Other than that, he was just stuck going to the subway, something that it felt like didn't even really bother him that much. Lila had these awesome laser vision eyes that she barely used. Alison's powers were the strongest that they'd ever been, but we only saw them being utilized on a gang leader. The most we saw powers being exhibited was probably when Luther and Diego were fighting in the CIA office, a scene that was just utterly pointless. This is something that I feel kind of ties into the previous point about the villains not being as strong in this season. Because there was no main villain for them to fight until the final moment of the show, they never really had a need to showcase their powers because they weren't being challenged at all. There was no commission for them to go up against, and there were no hit people that were after them, just the keepers whenever they encountered them, so that was a major letdown. The story got weak. For me, it kind of felt like the show was always building towards Sir Reginald Hargreaves being this master villain. After all, he was an alien that was living in disguise as a human on Earth. We caught glimpses of his true identity throughout the show, but it always felt like one day we'd learn a bit more about him and understand just how powerful he was and what his intentions with being on the planet were. Season 4 being the final season was the perfect opportunity for that story to come to fruition and for it to be shown to us, especially with the resetting of the universe being the very thing that he wanted and him being up in his tower looking down over the city. But that didn't happen at all. Reginald was a shell of the character that we knew. We never found out his identity, his origin, why he was on the planet, or really anything like that. He was just cast to the side in the final season and met his end. With regards to the actual plot of the final season, I think the fact that there was another apocalypse for the 4th time became the show's own worst enemy. They had to think of another way to make it exciting, and for us to feel like they weren't just going to save the world and there'd be this happy ending, or there'd be an apocalypse and them just survive. But this time round, they had to do it within 6 episodes, not 10. With the amount of episodes being cut dramatically, the story wasn't able to be fleshed out properly, and for there to be enough substance for us to be engaged with it, and for the pacing to feel right. The stories within the first 2 seasons were really well fleshed out, and the impending apocalypse had twists involved, which meant that there were a lot of thought-provoking things that would occur, such as Victor's complex over their powers and the fact that Reginald was suppressing them because he knew how dangerous he was. And even in Season 2, with them being split up in different years at the start and then having to find each other, to then having Harlan becoming this powerful weapon and Victor needing to regain their memory, there were layers to this story. In Season 3, the Sparrow Academy were made a big deal of when it came to the promotion of the show, but they were rendered obsolete in a few episodes, which felt pretty pointless. I also thought the incorporation of different timelines was something that went against the show. The whole multiverse is so complex and difficult to execute, and prior to Season 3, it felt like the show was mainly dealing with different periods of time in one timeline, and that worked perfectly for it. The moment it became a multiverse thing, I think it became too big of a task for the show to handle, because certain things started to not make sense and it didn't have consistency. For example, in Season 4, where the hell was Sloane? Ben from the Sparrow Academy was able to be in the timeline, but Sloane wasn't, and it was never really addressed. She only got a brief mention, despite being Luther's wife and somebody that he cared for deeply. As well as that, the post-credits scene for Season 3 was something which hinted at there being 2 different Bens in the timeline, but that was never addressed when the show returned either. Plus, when the siblings all had to agree for the cleanse to kill them so that they'd cease to exist and restore the one original timeline because that was all of the Marigold. What about all of the other children that were special? Plus, why did Diego and Lila's family still exist and Alison's daughter Claire still exist in the one remaining timeline? Because how would they have ever been born if their parents ceased to ever be present in the universe? It just made no sense at all. The show just felt like it was making up its own rules as it was going along. The introduction of Jennifer and Durango at a time where there were only 6 episodes, yet it being something which ultimately caused the last apocalypse, and for them to cease to exist felt like poor timing. Reginald should have been the main focus, not Jennifer and Ben, and this connection that we were supposed to just get on board with in a few episodes. Five and Lila's love arc was something that I also didn't buy into either. I didn't like the fact that they took 2 characters that once hated each other and had a love-hate relationship in the present day, and ultimately transformed them into 2 people that fell in love. I don't buy that Five would betray his brother, and having Diego and Five die hating one another made the dynamic feel really off and quite unsettling. At its core, this show has always been about the family and the togetherness that they have, so that not being present in their final moment didn't make sense in the slightest. I also felt like characters in Season 4 were just doing pointless side quests, whilst Victor was the only person that was connected to the main plot. Klaus was just this 2-dimensional comic relief type character, when previously he'd had such good development and we formed such a strong connection with him. It just felt like lazy writing and like they didn't want to give the writers the opportunity to create a good ending. They just wanted it told in the shortest amount of time. 6 episodes killed the season because there just wasn't enough time for the story to be told. Honestly, I think it's such a shame that the show was a shell of what it was when it first launched. Going from high 7s and 8s to concluding on a 5 is the perfect visual representation of a downfall, and the Umbrella Academy has sadly fallen victim to exactly that. Thanks for watching the video, I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully more than Season 4 of the Umbrella Academy at least. If you enjoyed it, then please hit subscribe, and if you want to watch more videos from me, then there's a playlist of 2024 movies broken down, and also the Umbrella Academy broken down in the top corner, if you can bring yourself to revisit the show. I'll catch you in the next one.